Okay, so now we're at chapter five, and chapter five focuses on the executive branch. Now, the executive branch is not just about the president, it's about the office of the presidency. And this is one of the things I think people don't understand about understanding the context of being the president, that it's not just about you, it's about the office that you represented that you should be respecting as you sit in that seat. Um, I think that we've had some very good presidents and we've had some that are not so good. It's up to you to decide what you think about the ones that have been more recent. But if you're going to decide on that, on those individuals, make sure you look at the big picture and not just the rhetoric. Sometimes we make decisions and believe certain things without doing our homework. And what I always encourage you to do is look at the factual information, not just what one news source or another says, but do your homework. Um, and one of the questions I always ask my students is that what do you expect? What type of individual do you expect to sit in that seat as a president? What type of role and responsibility should he have? How should he carry himself? Hopefully, she one day. I'm surprised we're one of the only countries that really hasn't had a female president yet, which is hopefully will change. Hopefully in the near future. Hopefully in our time. And but we have a long ways to go with some of the progressive things like this. Um, Anyhow, this chapter introduces you to the executive branch of the government. It's one of the most in-depth branches because the federal bureaucracy resides under this branch. The federal bureaucracy, meaning that for the various cabinet positions that deal with everything from Homeland Security to the finance and the accounting stuff to housing to all the various aspects of things that are necessary for this country to run and operate are housed within the various secretarial cabinets positions. And underneath all that is the entire federal bureaucracy, which means the entire infrastructure, or even what you could call the public administration system of our government or of our country, resides under the executive branch. So there's a lot of responsibilities, and sometimes I would argue there's not enough people there at the higher levels to oversee all the nuances that are required within the bureaucracy. But we do have congressmen and women whose jobs are to help have oversight over those various agencies and departments that reside under the federal bureaucracy. But you'll learn about in this chapter the history of the president, how the role of the president has advanced over a period of time from the beginning, starting with Washington and those early presidents where they were more or less administrators, didn't really take on a more executive, didn't utilize or overreach their executive role, partially for a couple reasons. One is you had King George. I mean, after dealing with King George, the colonists were no longer remotely interested in having a strong leader or dictator be the president. So I think the early leaders realized that and did a very good job of just trying to get the country up and running. It wasn't until the around 1830 or so, or the mid 1830s, when Andrew Jackson comes to power, and he's the first one to really sort of take over and kind of use a sort of very strong-armed, strong-handed executive privilege and leadership role. And from that point, it just throughout the 19th century, it evolved in various iterations. There were some very good presidents like Lincoln, and there were some very horrible presidents further down the road. We come to the 20th century, and of course, you have some amazing presidents in there. Certainly, Teddy Roosevelt could be considered one of the early environmentalists, one of the first presidents to have sort of a global vision of the world that we were heading into the 20th century. And I think that really made him quite a unique individual in the early 20th century. Of course, we had a couple of world wars and a lot of other smaller wars throughout the century. And sometimes the legacy of a president is based on how they respond during times of crisis. Sometimes you can have a good president, but not much is going on, so they're not as revered as those that may not have been quite as good, but how they handle themselves during crisis may have given them a certain place in history. Um, but nonetheless, you'll learn the evolution of that. We'll talk about the contentious reality of the enhanced executive powers that seem to be become more prevalent today with the presidents utilizing and consolidating their base of power, which is a complete problematic issue for the separation of powers that were the founding fathers put together in our Constitution. Uh, and so you'll learn about the president's role and how he works how he's supposed to work with Congress, and also how he works with with the judicial branch as well. So you'll learn about some presidents in the videos in this chapter that I think are very prolific, like Kennedy, who really got young people excited about being involved in politics. And you'll see a couple of video clips about him. You'll see one on Lyndon Johnson, who, while he gets blamed a lot for Vietnam War, was probably the primary president for bringing about changes in our society that really said that people should matter. uh, and he's the one who actually brought us with financial aid, work study, various grants and scholarships, all a result of Lyndon Johnson, along with environmentalism. He was probably the most socially conscious president that we've ever had in history. And for that reason alone, for those reasons alone, I think he's arguably in that realm one of the greatest presidents we've ever had in many ways. Yet nondescript in some ways because of the Vietnam War. Uh, okay, so enjoy. I will see you for chapter 6.